Hi, Carl here for ProAV TV, and I'm at our Sony Open Day here at ProAV talking to Alister Chapman. So, thank you so much for taking the time for today, first of all.
Yeah, great, it's good to be here.
So, let's give the audience a little bit of a run through as to what we're going to be covering in today's Open Day. What are you going to be talking about?
So today is a workshop on HDR, but the big thing for me is to debunk it, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what HDR is, what you have to do to make an HDR program. So the first thing is to debunk it, discover what it is, and then to go on and look at the key things that you need to understand to be able to produce an HDR program. Now, it's sponsored by Sony, so we'll be looking at Sony cameras in a lot of detail, but at the same time just going over the general principles of how to make an HDR production. So we'll be looking at how you shoot it, how you handle it in post-production, and then how you deliver it. So the whole end-to-end workflow, with lots of hints and tips and stuff that I've learned over the last 4 years of doing HDR content.
And Sony have gone quite heavy on different ends of the spectrum, haven't they? I mean, they've gone quite heavy towards HLG, down in most of their cameras now, really, isn't it? And then what are they doing up at the high end, up at Venice and things like that?
Yeah, so I think part of the thinking that Sony have currently is that at the budget end, people are going to want to produce what they call instant HDR, and that works very well. So you can just shoot using HLG, edit it with your existing laptop infrastructure, whatever you have, and show it on HDR TV, and it's instant and it's HDR. Really simple, really quick, really easy. But there are limitations when you do that in terms of dynamic range and all sorts of things, and grading capability.
Creative control.
Yeah, so if you want to have the very best HDR, it's not the best approach. So the other end, when you're talking of sort of F55, Venice, FS7 to a degree as well, they're going back to a more traditional workflow where you simply shoot with a very big dynamic range using log or using raw.
Yep.
And
which they've been doing for a while, haven't they?
Yeah,
I mean,
so nothing changes. And this is one of the things to get over to people today about HDR is actually in that respect, nothing changes. The way you shoot doesn't really change. I mean, there's a few small things you need to think about with exposure, but really that doesn't change. Where the big changes come then is in post-production and delivery. Post-production, largely it's just a case of having an HDR monitor and just grading for that monitor. And then delivery is where your nightmares start, because there's different standards, there's grading for specific monitors or TVs becomes necessary and things like that. And that's where your nightmares are. But from a shooting point of view, at the high end, you just shoot and capture the best quality that you can to give post-production the most flexibility that there is. And that's just the way you do it for anything, really.
So how much HDR are you doing now in your own work? Because you do work, I mean, you do a lot of storms and stuff like that,
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, so one of the things I've done for decades now is storms and filming severe weather. And that's for stock footage, and that gets used in feature films, it gets used in all sorts of places.
I imagine HDR's brilliant for that, isn't it? Those bright streaks of lightning. And
yeah, you've hit it exactly on the head there. Is actually the biggest difference there is lightning. Yeah. So on a standard dynamic range TV, a bolt of lightning is only barely brighter than what would be a white piece of paper on that TV screen. So it doesn't really look like lightning, it just looks like someone's got a chalk and chalked a zigzaggy line down the screen. But in an HDR display, that lightning is 3, 4, even up to 10 times brighter. So suddenly it looks like lightning again.
You get that feeling of, oh, that was bright.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, it lights up the whole room when it flashes, and generally the HDR TVs, they tend to be better quality panels, so it's just an overall better image. So I am seeing people demanding that and asking for that. But the other thing is, at the moment, I'm right in the middle of a huge project that's a multi-year project for a client, and it has to be HDR. All the delivery is in HDR. And any company really that's, if you're doing corporate videos, that are looking towards the future, that want footage that they can use in a couple of years' time, needs to start thinking about HDR. The broadcast television, we're not seeing anything yet other than a few test films. So one of the Blue Planet episodes was shown by the BBC in HDR, and it looked fun. It looked amazing.
In HLG.
HLG, that's right. And it looked really good. This stuff's going to come at us like a steam train. Now, when we went to 4K, lots of people, myself included, talking about 4K, and I don't get me wrong, I love 4K. It's a great thing, I think. But for most people at home, normal viewing distances, normal screen sizes, they can't see the difference. It's barely any different. HDR is obviously different and obviously better. The difference is clear. The viewing distance is irrelevant, and even resolution is irrelevant. So one of the things that's coming is going to be HD HDR.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's so significant is because for the broadcasters, the traditional broadcasters like the BBC, they don't have to change their infrastructure. HLG has a degree of backwards compatibility with standard television. So the concept is you'll be able to broadcast in HLG. Viewers with ordinary TVs get an ordinary picture. People with HDR TVs get an HDR picture. The broadcaster doesn't need to spend a fortune on new infrastructure. Yes, there's some changes at the camera end. And everybody gets a better picture if you have one of these TVs.
Yeah.
Whereas
TV manufacturers are going to love it.
TV manufacturers, obviously, they love it. They're pushing it really hard. You go into most TV stores now, and an awful lot of TVs are HDR. But the big deal is that to go to 4K is really hard for a broadcaster. It's a bigger signal. It needs 4 times the bandwidth. HDR is not a bigger signal. It doesn't need any more bandwidth. So they can do it, and they can do it now with very little cost. So we're likely to see a much bigger uptake on HDR than we are on 4K. So, and I don't think people really realise this. And in 2 or 3 years' time, it's very likely that the BBC and people like will be broadcasting in HDR.
Yep. It's very tempting to sort of ignore HDR and think, oh, that's only for the high end.
Yes. And it will creep down into everything. I mean, HLG, there's actually a big argument that says, why not shoot everything in HLG?
Yeah.
Because it looks okay on an ordinary TV and it's HDR.
Yeah.
So why not do it?
We see now it's available in some of the smaller cameras, people using it instead of log because they prefer the colours and things like
and
that.
it's coming to consumer cameras, it's everywhere.
Yep.
And I think a lot of people will get left behind if they're not careful on understanding how you need to handle it, and especially at the delivery end, what you have to do to deliver it in the correct way.
So for your own work, are you using HLG, are you using HDR10 and shooting log, or are you using a mixture?
No, so I'm shooting almost entirely with RAW because those are the cameras that I've got. So I've got the FS5 using the Atomos and shooting with ProRes RAW with that.
Okay.
Great low cost option, portable, lightweight, put the camera on a gimbal, do stuff like that. And then at the other end, I've been doing quite a few productions recently on Sony's Venice camera, which is just gorgeous, and I'd love to own one, but that is, to be honest, out of my price range. That's a rental
It's
job.
out of most people's price range, let's be honest.
So that's a rental job, but I still have my F5 and the RAW recorder for that as well, and that is my sort of go-to, my own camera for shooting RAW. But of course, there would be nothing to stop somebody if you don't have RAW to do it in S-Log. And that would be, next best thing, S-Log 2, S-Log 3, doesn't really matter which one you choose, and you're going to get some great material that is future-proof. And this is the thing, if you shoot with HLG, you're kind of tying yourself into the HLG domain. But if you shoot with log, I use the word digital negative. It's not really a negative, but I think it explains what you're creating, is you're creating something that can be then developed and processed into whatever you need. So if you need HDR10, you can do to HDR10. If you need HLG, you can do HLG. If you need 709, you can do 709, all from that log master. So that's what I tend to shoot, log or raw. Gives me a master that I can change. And what's really interesting is because I've been shooting in log and raw for so many years now, I've been able to go back to footage that's 4 years old that was either log or raw and turn it into HDR content. And it looks amazing. It looks great. It looks far better than it did when I shot it. And I think that's just amazing.
And what are you using post-production-wise to do that? Do you work in DaVinci Resolve, and do you have a HDR monitor at all?
Yes, so this is where your biggest changes actually come, is cameras. Yes, for HLG, you want a camera with HLG, so you might make a change there. But in post-production, I'm using DaVinci Resolve now for my entire workflow. I used to edit in Premiere, but I'm, for various reasons, now switching over to Resolve. It keeps it simpler, the workflow. The editing functions in it now are very capable, very powerful. And then I do all my grading in Resolve, and yes, I have an HDR monitor. So at the moment, my HDR monitoring is a little bit limited, and I think this is an area where we're still waiting for the monitor manufacturers to catch up.
I mean, I suppose technically you need, what, a Sony X300 or something like that?
I would love a Sony X300, but what's that, £25,000, something like that? It's a gorgeous monitor, and it's the industry standard. It's what all the big guys use, but for us people on smaller budgets, it's not practical. So I'm using currently an Atomos Inferno, tiny little screen, but actually surprisingly accurate. And if you compare it to if I grade on the Inferno, I know it's a tiny screen, and then I look at it on an X300, it looks great on the X300. So that Inferno is getting me into the right, well into the right ballpark.
Oh, that's really interesting. Have you tried a Sumo?
Yeah,
one of the
I'm
bigger
looking
ones?
very closely at the Sumo, and that may well be my next purchase. It's kind of a little bit in between on the size front, because the other thing that I also use is an HDR TV. Because I'm shooting in 4K, and obviously, you know, focus becomes really critical. I mean, that's one of the things with HDR, because the contrast is greater. You can see the resolution more clearly, because obviously contrast and resolution go hand in hand. So things like focus do actually become a little bit more critical, because if you're a
Combine
little
that
bit
with
off...
4K as well, which
Yes.
also makes it more critical.
So the Sumo at 19 inches, it's not really big enough to see the 4K aspect. It's good as an HDR monitor. So I still have an HDR TV, which is a full 4K TV in the grading suite. And also the other thing is the HDR TVs do some weird and wonderful things. So it's quite nice to see those things actually happening, because that's how most people are going to watch the footage anyway.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, I guess we should probably let some people in.
Yes.
Start the actual talks,
Indeed,
but
let's get
thank
on.
you so much.
You're welcome.